September 11th, 1697, the banks of the Tisza River in northern Serbia. When Austrian cavalry commander Leopold Schlick dismounted his horse at dawn, he expected to count enemy dead. What he found instead made him vomit into the reeds. The river wasn't flowing. It was clogged. 30,000 bodies, men and horses, formed a dam of flesh and bone stretching half a mile downstream. The water ran red for 3 days. Ottoman war horses, some of the finest bred animals in Europe, floated with their riders still in the saddle, frozen in their final moments of terror. But the evidence Schlick discovered in his dispatch, later buried in the Habsburg military archives for over a century, revealed something far more disturbing than a simple military defeat. The Ottomans hadn't just lost a battle, they'd been systematically driven into a death trap, their escape routes deliberately sealed, their panic weaponized. And the man who orchestrated it all did so with such calculated precision that historians would struggle for centuries to categorize what actually happened at Zenta. Was it a brilliant military victory? Or was it one of history's most methodical mass killings disguised as warfare? But the truth was far more terrifying. Before we uncover the truth about the Battle of Zenta and the 30,000 Ottoman horses that drowned in the Tisza River under Prince Eugene of Savoy's watch, make sure to subscribe to Fear Sermon and ring that notification bell. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers around the world. Now, let's descend into one of military history's darkest chapters. The year 1697 marked the 16th year of the Great Turkish War, a conflict that had already consumed hundreds of thousands of lives across Central Europe. The Ottoman Empire, once the terror of Christendom, was in retreat. Sultan Mustafa II had taken the throne just 3 years earlier, determined to reverse the humiliating losses his empire had suffered. He was young, ambitious, and commanded the largest Ottoman army assembled in a generation, over 100,000 men, including the elite Janissaries and the legendary Sipahi cavalry. Facing him was a man who would become known as the greatest military commander of his age, Prince Eugene of Savoy. Born in Paris, rejected by Louis XIV for military service due to his small stature and effeminate appearance, Eugene had found his calling in service to the Habsburg Empire. At 34, he commanded the imperial army with a reputation for brilliance and ruthlessness in equal measure. But what history remembers as Eugene's greatest triumph began with a series of decisions that, when examined closely, reveal something far more calculated than battlefield genius. The late summer of 1697 found Sultan Mustafa II's army laying siege to the Habsburg fortress of Zenta, near the Tisza River in what is now northern Serbia. The Tisza, a tributary of the Danube, was a meandering, treacherous waterway, prone to flooding and notorious for its unpredictable currents. The Ottomans had established their camp on the western bank, their backs to the river, a position that violated every principle of Ottoman military doctrine. Why would seasoned Ottoman commanders make such a fundamental error? Contemporary accounts suggest they had little choice. Eugene's forces had been harrying the Ottoman supply lines for weeks, forcing Mustafa's army into increasingly desperate positions. The siege of Zenta was meant to be a quick victory to restore morale before the autumn rains made campaigning impossible. Local Hungarian villagers, interviewed by Franciscan monks in the months following the battle, reported something strange in the weeks leading up to September 11th. Imperial troops had been active along the Tisza's eastern bank, but they weren't fortifying positions or preparing obvious defenses. They were surveying, measuring. One elderly fisherman named Janos Kovacs told a priest that Austrian engineers had asked him detailed questions about the river's depth, current speed, and the location of every ford and shallow crossing for 20 miles in either direction. "They asked me where a man on horseback would drown," Kovacs reported. "I thought it was a strange question for engineers to ask." The Habsburg military archives contain an unusual document from this period, a detailed hydrographic survey of the Tisza River commissioned personally by Prince Eugene and completed just 3 weeks before the battle. The survey noted every possible escape route across the river, every shallow ford, every section of bank firm enough to support cavalry. Next to each location, in Eugene's own handwriting, appear notes about optimal denial strategies and channeling mechanisms. This was no ordinary battle preparation. This was the planning of an abattoir. September 9, 1697, 2 days before the battle. The first unusual incident occurred when Imperial cavalry units began a series of aggressive probes against the Ottoman camp. These weren't serious attacks. They were carefully calibrated to provoke without causing significant damage. Ottoman commanders, frustrated by weeks of harassment, took the bait. They sent large cavalry detachments to chase off the Austrian harassers. Each time the imperial forces withdrew in apparent panic. Each time they led the Ottoman cavalry further from their main camp. And each time they led them away from the few viable river crossings. A letter from an Ottoman cavalry officer, Hasan Pasha, to his brother in Istanbul, discovered in the Topkapi Palace archives in 1847, describes this period with growing unease. The Austrian dogs flee before our horsemen like rabbits, but they flee in patterns. They lead us through marshland and difficult ground, always away from the river fords. Our horses tire while theirs remain fresh. The men joke that the Austrians are cowards, but I see method in their retreat. They are teaching our horses to fear certain ground, to avoid certain paths. By the time we realize we've been trained like dogs, it may be too late. Hasan Pasha's letter ends abruptly. He died 2 days later in the Tisza River. September 10th, the day before the battle. Sultan Mustafa II called a council of war. According to the detailed account kept by the Sultan's private secretary, Dmitry Cantemir, who later defected to the Russians and published his memoirs, the Ottoman commanders were divided. The Grand Vizier Elmas Mehmed Pasha urged an immediate withdrawal across the Tisza. He had received reconnaissance reports that Eugene's entire army was approaching rapidly, and the Ottoman position, with the river at their backs, was indefensible. But Sultan Mustafa, young and proud, refused. He had not led the largest Ottoman army in decades across half the Balkans to flee from the outnumbered Austrians. The siege of Zenta would continue. However, Cantemir records a crucial detail. Mustafa ordered that pontoon bridges be constructed across the Tisza as a precautionary measure. If a fighting withdrawal became necessary, the army needed a clear line of retreat. That night, something happened that wouldn't be discovered until dawn. The construction of those pontoon bridges proceeded throughout the night, with thousands of Ottoman engineers and laborers working by torchlight. But at some point in the darkness, small units of imperial forces, likely Hungarian irregulars intimately familiar with the terrain, infiltrated the river approaches. They didn't attack. They sabotaged. Bridge timbers were partially sawn through, anchor ropes were frayed, support pontoons were holed below the waterline. The work was subtle enough that in darkness the damage went unnoticed. The bridges looked secure. They would hold under the weight of marching infantry. But the moment hundreds of panicked cavalry horses tried to cross them simultaneously, they would collapse. One Hungarian irregular, a man named István Nagy, confessed to a priest on his deathbed in 1742, 45 years after the battle, that he had been part of this sabotage team. His confession, preserved in the parish records of Szeged, is chilling. We were told by the prince's officers that we were crippling bridges to deny the enemy an escape route. We thought we were ensuring a great victory. It was only later, when I saw what happened at the river, that I understood. We hadn't sealed an escape route. We had built a death funnel, and I can still hear the horses screaming in my sleep. September 11th, 1697, 3 a.m. Prince Eugene's army completed its forced march and took up positions surrounding the Ottoman camp on 3 sides. The 4th side, pressed against the Tisza River, was left deliberately open. To the Ottomans, this appeared to be either an oversight or evidence that the Austrian force was too small to complete an encirclement. It was neither. It was the final element of the trap. If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button. What we're about to uncover gets even darker. Share this with someone who loves historical mysteries, and let's discover what happens next. September 11th, 1697, 11:00 a.m. The battle began with an Ottoman cavalry charge, one of the largest mounted assaults in military history. 15,000 Sipahi cavalry, the cream of the Ottoman military, thundered toward the imperial lines. These weren't ordinary soldiers. They were aristocratic warriors, each mounted on horses that cost more than a peasant family would earn in a lifetime. Arabian and Turkish breeds, trained from birth for war, their bloodlines carefully maintained for generations. Prince Eugene's response violated every convention of early modern warfare. Rather than meeting the charge with his own cavalry or forming defensive squares of infantry, he ordered his forces to part, to open corridors, to let the Ottoman cavalry through. Contemporary observers were baffled. The Spanish military attaché, Don Fernando de Guzman, writing in his campaign diary, noted, "The prince has lost his mind. He opens his lines to the enemy cavalry. We will be slaughtered from behind." But Eugene's officers, trained in his methods, understood. They weren't letting the cavalry through, they were channeling them. The Ottoman charge found itself funneled into increasingly narrow approaches. Imperial artillery, positioned with unusual precision, didn't fire at the leading cavalry units. They fired at the rear and the flanks, not to kill but to compress, to panic, to drive the horses closer together. What had been a disciplined charge began to compress into a stampeding mass. And that's when Eugene sprang the second part of his trap. Hidden infantry units, positioned in the marshland that the Ottomans had been conditioned over the past 2 days to avoid, emerged and began firing not at the Ottoman riders, but at the horses. Musket balls and arrows specifically targeted the animals' legs and flanks, wounds designed to cause pain and terror rather than immediate death. The effect was instantaneous. Highly trained war horses, feeling the sting of wounds from every direction, their riders unable to control them in the compressed space, began to panic. A panic that spread like wildfire through 15,000 horses compressed into a space that should have held 3,000. Ottoman officers tried desperately to restore order, but the fundamental physics of cavalry warfare betrayed them. A trained war horse weighs between 1,000 and 1,500 pounds and can gallop at 30 miles per hour. When 15,000 such animals panic simultaneously in a confined space, the result isn't a military maneuver, it's an avalanche of flesh. The mass of terrified horses and riders did exactly what Prince Eugene had calculated they would do. They ran for the only apparent escape route, the Tisza River and the pontoon bridges that promised safety on the eastern bank. What happened next was documented by dozens of eyewitnesses from both sides, but the most detailed account comes from a Jesuit priest, Father Matthias Schneider, who had been attached to the imperial army as a chaplain. His testimony, written the day after the battle and preserved in the Jesuit archives in Vienna, reads like something from Dante's Inferno. The leading horses reached the bridges at full gallop. The structures held for perhaps 20 seconds under the initial charge, long enough for the first 100 horses to reach the middle span. Then I heard a sound I shall never forget, a great cracking, like the bones of the earth breaking. The bridges, which had seemed so solid, collapsed all at once. Hundreds of horses and men plunged into the Tisza. But the true horror was behind them. Thousands more horses, blind with panic, unable to stop their momentum, continued to pour into the river. They trampled the drowning, pushed them under, created a living dam of struggling bodies. The river was not wide, perhaps 70 yards at that point, but the weight and number of bodies was so great that they couldn't even swim. They drowned standing up, pressed together so tightly that they died on their feet. And still more came. The horses behind couldn't see what was happening. They only knew they were being fired upon from behind, and that their herd was running toward the river. So they ran too. For 30 minutes, horses and men poured into the Tisza River like water from a spout. The sound was indescribable. Tens of thousands of animals screaming, men crying out in Turkish and Arabic, the splash of bodies, the crack of breaking bones. I saw horses trying to climb over the massive bodies, only to add themselves to the pile. I saw men swept downstream, still in their saddles, as their dying horses carried them to their graves. Prince Eugene sat on his horse upon a small rise, watching through his spyglass. He never gave an order to stop the artillery fire that continued to drive the Ottoman cavalry toward the river. He watched, silent and still, as an entire army drowned before his eyes. The killing in the river continued for over an hour. Ottoman infantry, seeing the catastrophe befalling their cavalry, attempted to organize a defensive line, but the psychological impact of watching their entire mounted force drown was devastating. Sultan Mustafa II, recognizing that the battle was lost, fled the field with a small bodyguard, abandoning his army to its fate. By nightfall, the Ottoman army had ceased to exist as a fighting force. The official casualty figures, compiled by imperial officials in the weeks following the battle, list approximately 30,000 Ottoman dead. But Leopold Schlick's dispatch, the one that was buried in the archives for over a century, contains a more specific and disturbing breakdown. Of the enemy dead, approximately 20,000 perished in the river or on its banks. Of these, nearly 12,000 were cavalry mounts that drowned with their riders still in the saddle. Our troops report that the river is impassable due to the mass of bodies. Engineers estimate that the corpses form a dam approximately 800 yards in length. The water has ceased to flow in this section of the river. The stench is unbearable at a distance of 2 miles. We have recovered enemy battle standards, artillery pieces, and the Sultan's personal treasury, but the primary result of this engagement was not capture or conventional battlefield victory. It was, in essence, a mass drowning orchestrated through the deliberate manipulation of enemy movement and the exploitation of animal panic response. Schlick's dispatch ends with a sentence that was heavily inked out, likely by Habsburg censors, but which modern historians have recovered using imaging technology. I am uncertain whether what I witnessed today constitutes the prince's greatest triumph or his darkest crime. In the immediate aftermath of the Battle of Zenta, Prince Eugene of Savoy became the most celebrated military commander in Europe. Emperor Leopold I awarded him vast estates and the title of Prince of the Holy Roman Empire. The Pope blessed him as a defender of Christendom. Across Catholic Europe, bells rang in celebration of the great victory over the Ottoman Turks. But behind the celebrations, a quieter and more troubling process was unfolding. The problem was the river. The Tisza River, clogged with approximately 30,000 human and animal corpses, had become a public health catastrophe. Local Hungarian villages downstream began reporting mass illness within days of the battle. The water, the only source of drinking water for thousands of people, was contaminated with decomposing flesh. Typhoid and dysentery swept through the region. The death toll among civilians in the months following the battle may have equaled the military casualties of the battle itself. Habsburg authorities dispatched military engineers to deal with the problem. What they found exceeded their worst fears. The mass of bodies had indeed formed a dam. The river had begun to overflow its banks, flooding farmland and threatening to change its course permanently. The engineers' solution was both practical and horrifying. They used explosives to break up the dam of corpses. A military engineer named Johann Fuchs kept a private diary of this operation, later published by his grandson in 1789. His entries make for grim reading. November 15, 1697. We have been at this foul work for 6 weeks now. The bodies, after 2 months in the water, have begun to come apart on their own, but they remain tangled together, men clutching their horses' manes, horses' legs caught in other horses' harnesses, bodies locked together by the rigor of death. We must use hooks and ropes to drag them apart. The men refuse to work without masks soaked in vinegar, but still, many have fallen ill. Yesterday we pulled out a section that contained 17 horses still connected in a line, their riders still mounted. They had drowned upright, pushed together so tightly by the mass behind them that they died standing in the saddle. I have seen many things in 20 years of military service, but this has broken something in me that I fear will never heal. But the physical cleanup was the least of the problems facing Habsburg authorities. By late 1697, disturbing questions were beginning to circulate in European diplomatic circles. How had the Ottomans, known for their military sophistication, allowed themselves to be trapped so completely? Why had Prince Eugene left one side of the encirclement open? And did he know it led to a death trap? What explained the sabotaged bridges? The Venetian ambassador to Vienna, Giovanni Capello, sent a series of dispatches back to the Doge in late 1697 and early 1698 that raised these questions explicitly. Capello had interviewed several of Eugene's senior officers and had come to a troubling conclusion. The victory at Zenta was not the result of battlefield opportunism, but of meticulous planning. The prince knew the ground, knew the river, and knew how the enemy would respond to specific pressures. What troubles me is not his brilliance, but his calculation. He engineered not merely a defeat but a massacre, and did so with such precision that one must ask whether the laws of war were observed, or whether we have celebrated something far darker. The Habsburg court moved quickly to suppress such questions. Capello was quietly recalled to Venice. Several officers who had expressed private doubts about the battle's conduct found their military careers stalled. And most significantly, Emperor Leopold I ordered that all detailed after-action reports from Zenta be classified. The official narrative of a brilliant military victory achieved through Eugene's tactical genius was to be the only narrative, but the Ottoman Empire was asking its own questions. Sultan Mustafa II, who had fled the battlefield and survived, faced intense criticism in Constantinople. His Grand Vizier, Elmas Mehmed Pasha, was executed for the defeat, the traditional Ottoman response to military failure. But private correspondence from Ottoman officials suggests a deeper understanding of what had occurred. A letter from the Venetian Bilo ambassador in Constantinople, reporting on Ottoman court discussions, notes, "The Turks understand that they were not merely defeated but trapped like animals. There is talk here not of a battle but of a great drowning orchestrated by the Austrian prince. Some of the Sultan's advisors have recommended that formal protests be lodged, that the empire demand accountability for what they characterize as a violation of the traditional laws of war. but such protests would require admitting the totality of the defeat, which the Sultan's pride will not permit, and so the matter is allowed to rest, though the resentment burns hot. The Ottoman Empire never did file a formal protest. To do so would have required acknowledging not just the military defeat, but the humiliating manner of it, that the renowned Ottoman cavalry had been herded like cattle into a river and drowned. Pride, in the end, enforced silence. The Treaty of Karlowitz, signed in 1699, ended the Great Turkish War. The Ottoman Empire ceded vast territories to the Habsburgs. The Battle of Zenta was cited as the decisive engagement that broke Ottoman military power in Europe. Prince Eugene went on to even greater victories, eventually becoming one of the most powerful men in Europe. But there was a human cost beyond the battlefield casualties. In the years following Zenta, several of Eugene's senior officers left military service under unusual circumstances. Colonel István Nagy, the Hungarian irregular who had confessed to sabotaging the bridges, spent the rest of his life in a monastery, performing penance. The Jesuit priest Matthias Schneider, who had witnessed the drowning, suffered what his superiors described as a crisis of faith, and was eventually released from his vows. He spent his final years in obscurity, reportedly drinking heavily and telling anyone who would listen that he had witnessed a crime disguised as a victory. Perhaps most tellingly, Prince Eugene himself never publicly discussed the tactical details of Zenta. He wrote no memoir, he gave no detailed account of how he achieved the victory. In his later years, when younger officers asked him about Zenta, hoping to learn from the master, he reportedly changed the subject. An aide recorded one such exchange in 1734, 3 years before Eugene's death. A young cavalry officer, eager and ambitious, asked the prince to describe how he had achieved the great encirclement at Zenta. The prince was silent for a long moment, then said, "I understood the ground, the river, and the nature of horses under panic, that is all." The officer pressed, asking about the tactical decisions, the timing, the psychological dimensions. The prince became visibly agitated and said sharply, "Some victories are best left unexplained. They serve their purpose and should be forgotten." When the officer persisted, the prince ended the conversation. "If you wish to become a great commander, learn everything you can from every battle, except that one." The Battle of Zenta stands at a crucial turning point in military history, but not for the reasons typically cited in textbooks. Yes, it marked the end of Ottoman expansion into Europe. Yes, it established Prince Eugene as a military genius. But more fundamentally, Zenta represented something new and troubling in warfare: the industrialization of killing through psychological manipulation and environmental exploitation. Before Zenta, battles in the early modern period followed certain conventions. Armies met on chosen ground. Officers observed codes of conduct. There were rules, often violated, but still acknowledged as existing. Zenta demonstrated that an army could be destroyed not through superior fighting, but through superior planning that weaponized the enemy's own panic and the environment itself. This realization did not go unnoticed by military theorists of the period. By the early 18th century, European military academies were quietly studying Zenta, not as a conventional battle, but as an example of what later theorists would call environmental warfare and psychological operations. The techniques Eugene employed, channeling enemy movement, manipulating terrain, exploiting animal psychology, creating artificial choke points, became standard elements of military planning. The Prussian military theorist Karl von Clausewitz, writing in the 1820s, referenced Zenta in his masterwork On War, though obliquely. There exists a category of victory that achieves its ends not through the destruction of the enemy's capacity to fight, but through the destruction of their ability to escape destruction. Such victories trouble the conscience precisely because they reveal the fine line between military necessity and murder. But the implications of Zenta went beyond military theory. The battle raised fundamental questions about the laws of war that had supposedly governed European conflict. Was it legitimate to engineer a massacre? If the goal was military victory, did the method matter? If the enemy could have been defeated through conventional means, was Eugene morally culpable for choosing a method that maximized casualties? These questions were never formally adjudicated in Eugene's lifetime. The concept of war crimes did not yet exist in any codified form, but the discomfort was palpable. Church authorities quietly debated the matter. In 1702, a theological disputation at the University of Salamanca examined the question whether a commander who achieves victory through stratagem that results in mass drowning of enemy forces commits a sin against the laws of just war. The conclusion was deliberately ambiguous. Such acts fall into a category for which our traditional frameworks provide insufficient guidance. The Battle of Zenta also revealed something darker about human nature and the disconnect between how societies remember war and how war is actually conducted. The official narrative, celebrated in paintings, poems, and histories throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, depicted Zenta as a glorious victory, a triumph of Christian Europe over the Ottoman threat. Church murals showed Prince Eugene bathed in divine light, trampling Turkish banners. Commemorative medals showed angels blessing Habsburg eagles. None of these artistic celebrations depicted what actually happened: 30,000 men and horses drowning in a river while artillery fire prevented their escape. The reality was too ugly, too disturbing, too at odds with the heroic narrative that societies need to sustain military institutions and national pride. This gap between sanitized memory and brutal reality would become a recurring theme in modern warfare. From the trenches of World War I to the bombing campaigns of World War II to contemporary drone warfare, societies have repeatedly demonstrated a need to remember war as heroic while conducting it with industrial efficiency. Zenta was perhaps the first example where this disconnect was so obvious that even contemporaries noticed it and chose to look away. The ecological impact of Zenta also deserves mention, though it was largely ignored by contemporaries. The mass death of 12,000 horses represented the destruction of centuries of careful breeding. Ottoman cavalry horses were some of the finest in the world, their bloodlines stretching back to Arabian desert horses selected for stamina, speed, and temperament. After Zenta, the Ottoman cavalry never fully recovered its former quality. The institutional knowledge of horse breeding, the carefully maintained stud farms, the family traditions of horsemanship, all were disrupted by the loss of so many animals and their riders in a single afternoon. Downstream communities along the Tisza suffered for generations. The contamination of the water, the disease outbreaks, and the psychological trauma of living in a region where the river had become a mass grave marked the local culture. Hungarian folktales from the region, collected by ethnographers in the 19th century, are filled with stories of the cursed river and ghost horses that could be heard crying out on foggy nights. Whether these were genuine, supernatural phenomena or collective trauma expressing itself through folklore is impossible to say, but the cultural wound was real and lasting. The Battle of Zenta was won on September 11, 1697, but the questions it raised have never been satisfactorily answered. Was Prince Eugene a brilliant commander who used all available means to achieve a necessary victory against a brutal enemy, or was he something darker, a man who understood that he could engineer a massacre and have it celebrated as heroism? The answer likely contains elements of both. Eugene was a product of his time, an era when the line between military necessity and atrocity was even blurrier than it is today. He faced an Ottoman army that had, in previous conflicts, engaged in its own share of brutality. The context was total war between civilizations that viewed each other as existential threats. But context doesn't erase the essential reality. Eugene engineered a situation where 30,000 human beings and 12,000 horses would drown, and he did so with such precision that it's impossible to claim it was an accident or an unintended consequence. He understood exactly what would happen when panicked cavalry was driven toward sabotaged bridges over a treacherous river. He planned for it. He executed that plan flawlessly. The fact that we still call it a battle rather than a massacre or a mass drowning reveals how much power lies in naming. The Ottoman Empire called it the Great Drowning. Habsburg authorities called it the Victory of Zenta. Both descriptions are accurate. Both shape how we understand what happened. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Zenta is how quickly it was forgotten in its full horror and remembered only as a glorious victory. Within a generation, the details of the drowning had faded from popular consciousness. By the 19th century, Zenta was just one more battle in the long history of European wars, notable for its decisiveness, but not particularly remarkable in its methods. It took modern historians, with access to archives on both sides and a more critical perspective on military heroism, to reconstruct what actually happened that day on the Tisza River. What they found was a battle that challenged comfortable assumptions about the nature of warfare, the character of celebrated commanders, and the relationship between military necessity and moral culpability. What do you think drove Prince Eugene of Savoy to such calculated extremes? Was he a military genius who understood that total victory required total ruthlessness? Or was there something darker in his character, a cold calculation that human lives, even tens of thousands of them, were simply variables in an equation? Leave your theories in the comments below. And if you found this deep dive into history's darkest corners compelling, subscribe to Fear Sermon for more lost chapters of human history that reveal uncomfortable truths about our past. Ring that notification bell so you never miss an episode. because understanding the full truth of our history, however dark, is the only way to ensure we don't repeat it. The horses are still screaming in the Tisza River. History just stopped listening. See you in the next video.